Welcome to another Pathfinder Friday. I'm James Jacobs. I'm the creative director. And with me today, I've got...
John Compton. I'm the Starfinder senior developer.
And why are you here today specifically?
I'm here because we're talking about the Age of Ashes adventure path, for which I wrote Volume 5, so 149, against the Scarlet Triad.
Cool. This is part of our whole Age of Ashes streams that we've been doing, shows we've been doing for all, where we get authors in and we just talk about developing secrets, fun little behind the scenes stories and stuff like that. There will be spoilers for the Age of Ashes adventure path. We'll try to minimize them, but we're going to be showing off maps. We're going to be talking about bad guys, and we're going to be talking about just all sorts of stuff. So keep that in mind. So yeah, why don't we just get going? I know for people that haven't seen the previous four we've done, what we were doing with these is we wanted on one hand to have it be, a new look at the second edition of Pathfinder. But we also wanted to feature in each one of them one of these 6 ancestries of the games, because we've got 6 ancestors, 6 parts. It made sense to do that. And with this one, it was a little tricky. For like the first one, we knew we had a goblin tribe. That made it obvious. And the second one, we had an elf a city that was also obvious. Fourth one was set in a dwarven underground city.
Third one in Ravenel has all the halflings of Cheliax.
Yeah, and then the last one, of course, is where the humanity experiment type stuff is going on. So it just made sense for all of those 5 which one was going on, and that meant gnomes had to be against the Scarlet Triad. And I knew that you are a big fan of gnomes because you always play gnomes in games I run, to great effect, I might add. And they're very delightful.
I'm 2 for 2.
Yeah. So when you said you were interested in writing one, and I kind of was like, well, which one are you looking for? And it just kind of, so what was your take on how to get gnomes into something about the set in Catapesh, which is basically everything is in Catapesh. So it's like,
well, one of the benefits is that when we did the Gnomes of Galarian book in Pathfinder First Edition, this would probably come out like 2011, somewhere around there. There was like a 4-page section or so that was like, where do you find gnomes? And one of the places was called Finder Plain, which is the settlement of maybe like 2,000 or so gnomes in central Catapesh. And the idea, and of course we need to remember that there's Catapesh the city and Catapesh the nation.
Yep.
So central Catapesh the nation. And the shtick with Finder Plain is that just as gnomes are oftentimes seeking novelty to stave off the bleaching and also for their own enjoyment, Finder Plain is a place where almost nobody lives there for more than a year. So it is a constant turnover of population. Even though there are a lot of permanent buildings, people will just be like, and I guess I'm done living at this house. So, oh, hey, you're new in town. You need a place to live? Great. Come on over here. I'll just move my stuff away. So it does a really nice job of highlighting one of the major features of gnomes is they're constantly seeking excitement, their curiosity, and those sorts of features. So it was a good fit there. We also had a couple of gnomes that were highlighted in the Dark Markets Catapesh campaign setting, which was one of the first campaign settings that Paizo did.
Right.
And so Finder Plain was featured there, but it also named a couple of different gnomes who were featured in the city itself. And so when I was starting to think about different plot lines, I was thinking to myself, okay, which gnomes do we even have in the city? I want to see about making sure that at least one of them is involved too, because as our first adventure path, as the start of second edition, I think there was a lot of great stuff to be said for showing how the setting has changed. But especially with such an old campaign setting book, I think there was really great value to saying, here are some of the things that are still true, even with one of our earlier books that we have not updated or revisited or talked about in a long time since.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things we wanted to do with Age of Ashes as well is we wanted it to be something that goes all over the place, because it's going to be a lot of people's very first adventure path because it's a new edition. And so we wanted to show off, like in Galarian, there's jungles, there's underground, there's big cities, there's deserts, there's all sorts of different things to do. And it was also a chance for us to go places we'd never gone before. With this adventure, we went back, like you said, to a place we went even before Pathfinder was actually a game. When back we were in the previous edition, 2 editions back, with Legacy of Fire was the first time we went to Catapesh. And so we've got stuff set in Katapesh going way, way back. I mean, the map of the city of Katapesh is something we did like, what, 10 years ago or something like that.
Thereabouts.
Yeah. So it was really another interesting challenge there too. We'll get into later with all the continuity and little secrets and surprises we woven into Katapesh coming back to, surprise us even.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was really fun to go back to somewhere that's not just previous edition, but 2 editions back and bring it up to date, really.
Yeah, so when it came to the Y-Gnomes, and we basically were able to get a couple of touchstones for who you were going to be meeting. And I knew really early on that Finder Plane was going to feature in some way. Mm-hmm. And when it came to planning out of Age of Ashes, I remember the different planning meetings that we had. And in those, it was always really clear like what the first 2 adventures were going to be.
Right.
It was always really clear what the 6th adventure was going to be. 3 and 4 kind of came together on their own, and then we had this blob of Katapesh plus gnomes XX.
Yep.
And so I found that I had a whole bunch of freedom in basically pitching the adventure so long as it started with where 4 left off.
Yep.
It brought us up to where 6 was going to take off, and it had gnomes plus Katapesh. So that was an atypical benefit of how we did that process. Is I had a lot of freedom on that front, and in doing so, like one of the first things I did was I looked back at our Katapesh publication. I said, what are the major touchstones of Katapesh? Because we haven't been there in a decade. I want to make sure that when somebody travels to Katapesh for the first time in this adventure, that they are experiencing what Katapesh is about. So it needs to have trade. It sure does have that huge arena in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. It has a bajillion guilds. And it has kind of a neat government as well, where it's not only a merchant council, but you have these 5 pact masters, these hooded figures who are kind of overseeing the whole thing, almost never interfere. But when they do, it's really meaningful and everybody takes note. So I knew I wanted all those features, but I had to also compare that to what the level was. And compared to the Jackal's Price, which was one of the Adventure Path volumes in Legacy of Fire, which was like level 7 to 9 or so, which is a super natural level range for urban adventures.
Yeah, it really fits well.
Yeah, this one was, I think, like level 15 through 18.
Yeah.
And so it's suddenly like, oh gosh, we can't just run and find old woman McCreary's lost puppy. We have
Rob's mom?
She lost her puppy. Like, go fetch it. Yeah, have 5,000 experience points for doing so.
Yep.
We had to have something that was going to be of a respectable scope for Katapesh and for urban adventures overall. But just as far as showing off a little bit of the art and the notions. Peyton, I believe there's an arena illustration that we have there. Yeah. So one of the things that's really important when we are doing these adventure paths is ordering the cover art. And unlike the interior art, which kind of gets ordered after the adventure is in and all that, or ideally, I mean, I know that I kind of stretched that a little bit. We have to order the cover art really early on. And so one of the things that James did is he asked me like, okay, in your expanded outline, I see you have an arena thing. They're fighting a giant creature. What is it? What can you tell me about it? And I always really loved the Solifugids, the not quite spiders, and figured this will be a great time to bring some of those back because there's one called like a Banshee Solifugid in Pathfinder First Edition. And just the notion of doing arena combat and being like, what am I going to do? Fight a gladiator or somebody with some javelins? No, you're going to fight this thing that's like the size of 5 houses.
Yeah.
Go nuts. But it's also really illustrative of one of the really big challenge, well, kind of a 2-part challenge that with our high-level adventures, and this one in particular, is a lot of our stuff in 2nd edition when we first launched our bestiary is, okay, we're bringing a lot of classic creatures in to the bestiary to make sure that you can run the adventures you used to run in 1st edition. A lot of those high-level creatures, though, are size huge or larger.
Yep.
And kind of early on, it was clear that we were going to be going into this place called the Red Pyramid, which is this 3-sided pyramid that mostly exists underground. And pyramid architecture is not really known for having wide corridors or things like that. So I was looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, at level 18, what from the bestiary can I even bring in? And so that was definitely a big struggle. We'll look at one of those maps later on. But we do have some questions. I see from Lori 7x3. How much in-house research do you guys do when you write an AP? That varies a lot by each person and by the step we are in the process.
Yeah, it's the very first step is once the developer who's running the adventure path starts it up, they will look through what we've done before and make sure that we're not, going against storylines we've already established and stuff like that. And with the more stuff we produce and publish, the bigger that imprint gets. And so the initial outline for the adventure path generally ends up being about 20,000 words long. And that's, if we were to publish that, it would be about 32 pages in length. And so that's takes about a month to get that first outline basically done and research and everything in place. And then we kick it over to the adventure writers, and then they have to do the same thing. They have to go through and build detailed outlines for their specific adventures. And it gets pretty complicated, and especially in something like this particular adventure where we've done a lot of stuff in Katapesh before, in adventure paths, in organized play, and the campaign setting line, all over the place. It's the second largest city in the inner city region, so it's one that's got a lot of just stuff happens there, and stuff happens elsewhere in the world that ties into it. So there was a lot of stuff to wade through, and in fact. That's a nice segue there is once this got all going, one of the main characters, and this is a deep spoiler, so heads up, one of the more powerful characters in the government is a veiled master, is this kind of eerie, ichthytic, spooky fish monster in human form that is doing their job as a government agent, but also is spying on the humans for their ultimate, detriment. And we had to put in a sidebar saying, it's like, hey, this guy's doing a minor role in the adventure. He's still not a human. So if you have a person come in and cast True Seeing or something on him, they're going to see something, they're going to get an eyeful. But that's not the story. So
yeah, and that particular character is one that when I was starting to create the adventure, I was like, all right, let me do searches through all the PDFs that have Katapeshi stuff and Veiled Masters, and what should I know about this person? I think I also looked him up on Pathfinder Wiki, and it's like, all right, what references should I know? Oh, Ruins of Aslan. That's weird. Why is this Katapeshi guy showing up? Oh, no. Oh, I can never put this person on screen. And so that was one of those points where like the author and the developer had slightly different takes on it. And I think I put in a comment of, I have excluded this person because X, and James was able to see a solution where we could still put that person on screen.
It really, what it really boiled down to is we could have just had them be on screen and not, mention anything. But for all of our NPCs in the settings and all of that, even if they aren't in a fight or anything like that, we need to indicate to the GM, what their gender is, what their ancestry is, what their job is, and most importantly, what their level is, so that if somebody tries to bluff them or to sense motive on them, they know what's going on. And that meant that we couldn't just say human, so we had to figure it out, and the sidebar was the right thing. So anyway,
so we have the arena stuff, we have trade going on, but also as far as scope goes. And just the AP as a whole, one of the features I really enjoyed about this is all the possibilities of using the Ayudara, the elf gates. So not only were these Ayudaran portals letting you jump all over the world in our adventures, but I really loved the idea when I was working on mine that when you go through one of these portals, it's not an instantaneous jump, or by your perception, it might not be. And so particularly as I was fighting with or struggling with this notion of all these huge, gargantuan, colossal, high-level things, I wanted more and more spaces in which to explore those things. And so one of them was, okay, the entity inside of the gateways is starting to wake up more and more, and so basically traps you on your way over to Katapesh in the first place, so that you have to face off against this thing that I think you end up facing off against more in Volume 6.
We'll get to that in like about a half hour or something. But around
there. So so I have some we have some art of that as well. I think there's a Burning of Breach Hill one where basically the entity is saying, that's the one, where the entity is saying, hey, I know what you're about. I know where you live. This is what you have to look forward to. So have fun being adventurers while you can, to be continued.
Yeah.
And so you have to ideally overcome this thing to shut it down long enough for you to finish up book 5.
Yeah, that's one of the things I actually really like about the adventure path format is that you've got each section has its own adventure, but then there's also this overarching story that you can tell, and having a theme that goes through an entire adventure path is really helpful in like making all of the adventures kind of feel like they're connected. You know, on its face, you know, with Age of Ashes, we've got a intrigue driven exploration of a city. We've got jungle, lost in the jungle, survive in the jungle. We've got dungeon crawls. We've got a very wide, unconnected thematically number of adventures, but putting in things like what John did here, putting in encounters that tie back to, you know, past events or future potential events helps to bring it all together in a really cool way.
Yeah, I see a couple other questions that I'm going to come back to about like the Red Pyramids map, and I'll come back to some of the how do we research APs stuff as well in just a little bit. Before I do, though, I want to talk a little bit more about some of those other ways that I was trying to approach different types of encounters. Because although you start in Finder Plane, you very quickly go on to Katapesh the city, at which point you are doing a lot of street level stuff. And one of the way that the adventure is broken down is that you have your target, the Scarlet Triad, in plain sight. Right. You know where they work. You could basically walk into their office and start using swords immediately. Yep. But they are also some of the favorite, one of the favorite organizations of the local government right now. And so a lot of the adventure is about turning public opinion. And that's one of the ways I was trying to do to show the stakes of high level. So instead of saying, oh, we're going to infiltrate this little guild, or we're going to own our own property or whatever, it's no, you are going to change the viewpoint of an entire city. In fact, probably one of the 3 largest ones in the Inner Sea region. Yeah. And so you're going between different guilds, and this was one of the places where, like, looking back at what we'd written about Katapesh was especially fun, because we have this list that I think it was Emperor Scott who wrote the Katapesh book. Yeah. And she put in like probably about 15 different guild names, and some of them are like really obvious as to what they do or why they exist. Like there's a mercenary guild, and but there are also some more mundane ones like the Guild of Butchers and Bakers and the Guild of Street Sweepers and Dung Cleaners. We're just like, how do these? Well, you know, no, I can see how they have power. Yeah, like, absolutely. It's like we will go on strike for a week, so consider your choices. But it's really great having each one of them be basically one of the target organizations that you need to change the opinion of. And so rather than just having it be go to this site, go to this site, you have a lot of use of the downtime system, which is new in 2nd edition. And so day by day, you can be splitting up as a party and saying, okay, you're going to go and try and impress the dung sweepers. You're going to go to the Jewelers Guild and try to bring them on board. And you can be making your skill checks. You can be doing your little role play scenes. And then as you like, you can regather as a group and head somewhere as sort of an action site in the city to do certain things. This was also a really fun way to incorporate a lot of holidays into things. Yeah. So the adventure assumes that this is taking place in Neth, which is basically November of that year. And that has a couple of different holidays that would be big in Katapesh. So Evoking Day is basically like they're going to shoot off fireworks. There's a holiday in which they have some sort of really, really bad news, like anti-Pact Masters criminal who gets paraded around the city, and you can interact with and or interfere with that parade. So it's stuff like that, which is a whole bunch of fun. And every time that you do one of these events, you can then change the opinions of multiple guilds all at once without having to talk to them more. But most of all, I wanted to be sure that we could get outside of the city at least once. And that's where the it's the Guild of Husbandry, I think it was. That's another thing too, is like we're on such a breakneck speed on like producing things. It's like we finish one, we go into the other one. But so it's like thinking back to what was going on, and adventures can get complicated. But yeah, it was well, there were
two cases where you got out of the city.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's the one where you go out to deal with the caravans getting attacked by giant bugs. Bugs. And the other one where you go out to basically chase a legendary camel.
Yeah, and so I was just
Which was the one that I was like, aha.
Yeah, so at this point in time, I think for fantasy RPGs, I just have horse fatigue. It's like every time that there's some sort of beautiful mount, it is the shadow facts of the land. And you're like, oh my gosh, another horse. And you look through several of our nations, like, this place is obsessed with horses. So is this one. I'm just like, no. Camel, give me the camels, because every time we'd look at the paladin or the cavalier, it'd be like, you can ride a horse or a camel. They ride a horse. And this was an opportunity to basically make the black stallion of camels. And the art of it, we have art of it. The
you got
Peyton,
it up here?
Yeah, Dune Shadow. That's the one where it's just like, I sent over an art brief to James. It was just like, I want this to be like a beautifully patterned, practically glowing, borderline supernatural camel that basically the Guild of Husbandry says, I will side with you if you can just bring me this impossible beast. Like, we have sent out hunters after hunters after hunters. What do you want us to find? Is it like some sort of manticore? Is it the Tarrasque? Like, what do you want us to kill? I want you to capture a camel. Sir, you understand that we're like level 16, right? In fact, we're level 17 by now.
That's why we're going to you.
Yeah, exactly.
No one else can do this.
You don't understand this camel. So it's a delight because you have to basically do a whole bunch of overland stuff and tracking it. And it's a fun extended skill challenge. But ultimately, more spoilers, you end up finding one of the reasons why this camel is so hard to find, which is the next art piece, Peyton, which is a giant Simurgh, which is like one of the few level 18 creatures in the bestiary. And as I was looking through this list of creatures, like, how can I use any of these? How can I use any of these? Like, okay, I can put a Simurgh out in the wilderness.
Yep.
And basically, the Simurgh says, this is a free creature. How dare you try to capture this? And you can try to persuade the Simurgh that this camel will be lavished with every luxury in the world and will lead a delightful, no animal cruelty life.
Yeah.
And if you can, kudos. If not, you have to fight this neutral good creature if you want to.
For some groups, that's fine. It's still level 18 creature.
It still is, yeah.
But one of the things I actually really liked about this was that it gave me an opportunity to get a variant illustration of a Simurgh into the game. And it's a creature from mythology. And I wanted to have one that was more closer to the mythological roots of it being a giant magic bird, rather than something that was more like a flying wolf or something like that, which that's fine, but it feels a little bit too
much of a departure.
Yeah, too much of a departure. It feels I've got this sort of inside gamer joke of the deadline monster, where it's like, you've got to come up with 10 monsters and you come up with 9, and your deadline's here. What's the 10th one? I don't know. Wolf, bird, wolf bird. And the joke is that's like where owlbears came from. And you do it right, and you get an owlbear, and it becomes its own force of nature. You do it wrong, as in most of the times you get a giraffe with the torso of a beetle.
Ooh.
And or something like that. That's anyway. You get monsters that are just they only seem to exist because they're like chimerical or something like that. So going back with this, it is on the, just looking at this illustration here, it's a glorious looking bird, but it's a bird. And that puts the onus of giving its personality and its abilities and stuff like that on the writer to come up with something a lot more interesting than that. Oh, it's a bird with a wolf head.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this wasn't the only avian creature that we had, because when I was going through this list, I was like, okay, well, apparently I'm going to use this golem, and I'm going to use one of these undead because that's what I have to work with. Another one that jumped out was the phoenix. And this was one where I knew it was going to have to basically be underground, because I couldn't just keep on sending people out to fight gargantuan birds. And so there's the next illustration I have, Peyton, is actually it might be a couple more down the line. Yeah, keep on going. That's the one. Is so if I have you fighting this Simurgh potentially, I want to have this situation where at the very least you have another opportunity to not punch the neutral good bird.
Yep.
And so in this case, the Scarlet Triad is dealing with a really powerful artifact that they're trying to repair. And I was thinking, okay, what sort of supernatural things would they need to repair this thing? You know what? If you jam a phoenix into a forge, even though it is probably 20 times too large to fit, but you find a way.
You concentrate that Phoenix fire.
Exactly. That sounds like exactly the sort of thing you would use to repair an artifact. So, all right, let's do this thing. And then I want to, like, some of these encounters that you create as authors are just, you can envision how it plays out. You just don't know where it's going to go or how the pieces are getting there. But the idea of a Phoenix on a countdown timer breaking out of a forge and saying, I don't know who any of you are. I hate everybody. I have been trapped in here for 20 years. Everybody will die now. And you having to talk it down was really fun, especially because there's at level 15, you get legendary skill training.
Right.
And there is a quick diplomacy or quick negotiator skill feat that says, as a 3-action task, I can make a diplomacy check to influence somebody as opposed to spending a minute. And I was like, this is just the sort of thing I want to like show off that opportunity. So if somebody has that, they can be like, no, and end the encounter right there, or turn the Phoenix against the next room's encounter as well.
Yeah. Another thing that's really fun about the Phoenix too is it's the very nature of the Phoenix is that if you kill it, you're not done fighting it. And so it could be a situation where you don't have somebody that's able to talk the Phoenix down and you're a good line party and you end up having to just kill it out of self-defense. And then it comes back and it's like it's had a chance to cool off and think things over, and you get another, like a second attempt to basically make friends with it even after it's had its temper tantrum.
Yeah. So even this, though, was one of those situations where it was going to be a gargantuan creature once it broke out, so it had to have enough room to do that, even though it wasn't stored like that. But I think this is probably a good opportunity for us to kind of look at some of the maps because when I was doing maps, I was thinking that this was going to be a real struggle because I am used to doing a lot of adventures where either in scenarios I can just borrow flip mats or where it's some sort of wilderness thing where I can say, you're in the desert, you'll do fine. Like put some cactuses on the battle mat and whatever. But these were going to use a lot of very specific buildings, and that was going to be a struggle. So I went to James kind of late in the process and was like, I think I'm going to have to just say this is a building of roughly this size. Go for it, GMs. And he was at that point experimenting with a new way of doing maps because normally we do half page or full page maps, but he had worked out a different deal. It was
more Sarah Robinson, Sonia Morse, and just a lot of the folks on the art team were like, we were looking for ways to give the new edition adventures something of a different, more modern, more innovative look. And like you said, we've been doing half-page maps and full-page maps. And by starting to do maps where we can like split them up and run them in line with text and have word wrap around it, it makes it look more dynamic. I mean, it kind of fights against that sort of metagame level of like where you're mapping it out and it's like, this map doesn't make a rectangle, we missed a secret door. So that element there is always fun, but
it also means less page flipping because you can have one of those full page dungeons and that page maps is responsible for the next 15 pages of text.
Yeah, exactly. And if you split it up, it's easier to have those encounters get closer where they actually are shown on a map.
So what we have posted up here right now is one of the city map features, where in this case it is 4 different maps used for 3 different encounters. So the top one is for basically a plaza ambush. The bottom right one is a salt warehouse where you face off against a rather tough foe after doing a rather lengthy investigation. And then the bottom left 2 are parts of a manor. And this is one of those where this is more me being kind of a secretive author in the process and kind of being like, James, I need to write the thing. Hang on. And I disappear for a week or 2 and I come back and I'm like, James, is it okay if I turned like 8,000 words of this into a heist? And it's like, and he was gracious about that one. But I knew I needed a couple of maps because any heist is going to have the possibility of things going south real fast. And so these are different maps that you can use when you are just having that quick scuffle with the guards in the manor house. But James was able to basically say, hey, look, you can split these up and then I'll just section them off. So those orange highlighted lines are where we ended up doing those cuts, even though we ordered the map as you see it now.
Yeah. This really is the next one, the Red Pyramid map.
The next map. So that what we have there is a finished map of one of the manor chunks.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
This one. And then what we're now going to be posting here is the Red Pyramid one, where this is one where it's like, okay, I know that I need to fill roughly this many encounters, and I need to fit it into a full page map because that's how we work. So there's a lot of this winding around itself. And I think this represents 4 different levels of a dungeon. So it starts off in the very top left area and kind of winds up into that little center top area. But then you go downstairs and you get into the below ground section where I had a lot more freedom to say, okay, since we're underground now, I can zig and zag as much as I want. But there was that earlier question about like, how much research do you do and why does the Red Pyramid map look different? Well, one of the reasons is because we were trying to fit it on a full page. But also that top left section in particular is relatively reminiscent of some of the Egyptian pyramids as they've been mapped, as their interiors have been mapped out. And so when I knew that I was working on a pyramid map, I just basically spent a couple hours trying to track down every interior pyramid map that I could and incorporate as much of that build as possible. So that central north-south ramp is at like roughly 35 degrees of incline leading up to your little like king's chamber and queen's chamber, as they're often called. But I tried to incorporate a couple of those elements into it so that I could really represent pyramid architecture as we know it in the real world.
Yeah, it's important I think, for dungeon maps to, when you look at them, to have their own personality. It's easy to just draw a bunch of squares on a piece of graph paper and connect it with hallways, and that just gets boring. But when you get to something like either a haunted house or a pyramid with tombs in it, or a castle or something like that, there's real world examples of like creepy old manors or ancient tombs or defensive like medieval castles and stuff like that. And doing the research of looking into how those things are actually built, what sorts of rooms are in there, really helps you not only to get a starting point for how to draw your map, because a lot of times you can have writer's block. You can just easily have like mapper's block, where it's like, I don't know where to start on this map. If you look at something like a real world monastery map, you'll see like, oh, these shapes happen a lot. I'll just start with there and then start,
Or even you look at it and you say, wow, those walls are thick.
Yeah.
I had the father of one of my friends growing up, who was also a D&D player, basically had a policy where if the GM drew a wall that was not at least like several feet thick on the map, he would not enter the room because he assumed it was some sort of like first edition D&D Gygaxian trap where the room would collapse on you.
Because the walls could just not support the weight and everything. Yeah.
And awesome. I've kind of internalized that at this point. Mark Moreland asks, why would I make a giant round room? Don't GMs have a hard enough time mapping without that? Yeah, but at least it is perfectly circular. And also, I think Mark's just trying to be facetious because he knows that GMs have complained about round rooms before and he's had to deal with it.
I mean, there's a certain level of that I can understand, where it's like if you're drawing a map onto a battle mat or something in the middle of a game, it's easier to draw things that follow the lines. But that goes back to my earlier comments, like, don't just do a bunch of square rooms because it's boring. You want your dungeons to look interesting, to look evocative, to look at a map and say, there's a weird shaped room in the middle of there because it's round and everything else is square. That makes the map more interesting, I think.
Yeah, and it makes it memorable for your players.
Yeah.
Like even when we were playing through our office game of Temple of Elemental Evil, there are some of the square rooms that we don't really remember the encounters, but we sure do remember like where the Juggernaut happened because it was a special shape.
Yeah. So, being a GM is a tough job because you got to be, an entertainer. You've got to be a judge. You've got to be a host. You've got to be, an actor. You've got to be an artist too. You've got to be able to present these things in a way that, I guess practice drawing circles. Like Patrick was saying yesterday, it's like round rooms are easy. You just drop a bucket on the table and draw a circle around it.
Yep.
So yeah, get buckets.
Let's see, Peyton, I'm seeing that there's a question that's just barely off our screen. What are the biggest differences in writing APs for Starfinder and Pathfinder besides the obvious things?
That's a great question because I don't know how to answer that.
So, there are a lot of things that are very that have a lot of overlap. For example, you're still going to be working off of a shared outline. You still have to be connecting with all of the different pieces that come before and after. You're still trying to hit certain story beats and certain level of scope, But the scope is a little bit different for Starfinder, in part because we have shorter volumes for those. And at this point, I've only written one Starfinder AP, Temple of the 12, which is number 2. But I had to do a little bit tighter writing to that because we were covering fewer levels, but also in a shorter amount of space. Starfinder also has a completely different mode of play that Pathfinder doesn't have that needs to be accounted for, Starship Combat. And we really try to get a Starship Combat into basically every volume of Starfinder AP. But also you have to account for some things that would throw off a lot of conventional stories, which is something that high-level Pathfinder has to deal with anyway. The idea of, oh, what if they just use their cell phone to call the person and say, don't open the door? Does that throw off the entire plot line? It could. Or, well, now they have sending instead.
That's something that, I mean, I'm in a Starfinder game as a player every Thursday, and Rob McCurry is running it, and that's something that we do all the time to him. It's like, why can't we fly our ship over there? Well, the adventure says you can't. It's like, give us a better reason and we won't. But if you don't, we're going to fly over there.
I gave you a reason.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point. It's really, there's a lot of, I'm also just finding, like, in playing Starfinder, even though it's still fundamentally a game about killing monsters and taking their things, just because it's drawing from science fiction tropes, my character in there doesn't feel as, like, eager to loot bodies, you know, or to, like, it's a weird, if I'm playing Pathfinder, I'm like, okay, we killed the goblins, let's take their stuff. You know, if I kill goblins in Starfinder, it's like, well, let's go on to the next encounter. It's a weird sort of mental block. You don't see Mulder and Scully looting the dead.
Yeah, and I think
usually,
I mean, there's that, but it's
there
also,
was that one up. No.
but it's also like when I think about sci-fi in combat encounters, I think of scenes where, like, oh, yes, they fight the stormtroopers or whatever, and they grab one of their guns off the ground to use in the next 90 seconds of action,
right? And
then before you know it, it's now completely out of the picture, right? Because they only grab those things out of more of desperation,
out of story beats. Yeah,
exactly. So I think there's that as well.
Anything else you got that you wanted to cover, or should we open it up to more questions?
Actually, one more thing is the nature of high-level humanoids. So this is one of those things that was really tricky in tackling Katapesh, because in our publication back in, well, pre-first edition even, a lot of the guards and a lot of the power brokers were like level 4 through 9, despite it being an immense city. And when it came to looking at a level 16 to 18 adventure, that was a situation where I was like, okay, well, what if the PCs misbehave? Like, are just some level 5 Zephyr Guard going to show up and be like, we're some of the most powerful guards in the Inner Sea region, mowed down by the PCs who say, we don't care. The pack masters themselves show up and say, you really shouldn't do that sort of thing. Don't care. We own the city now. And even just to have natural threats for the Scarlet Triad, like if you face off against a bunch of their enforcers, they're not just level 3 people with stats.
They're significant.
They're significant. And that's partly because we need to match what the PC's level is.
Right.
And so I have little doubt in my mind that if this had been ordered as a level 7 to 9 adventure, these would have been like level 5 or 6 guards.
Right. Yep. I think one of the keys there is that by making this group, the Scarlet Triad, is a brand new group. There's no continuity to them. There's no canon to them. We had a lot more leeway about deciding what levels they were and what levels they weren't. But you're absolutely right for things like the Zephyr Guard and other established characters. That's, I mean, sort of a problem of our own design, because way back in the early days when we were starting up the campaign setting, I think our first couple of world books didn't even include levels for anybody. We didn't say what level Queen Abigail was or anything like that, because in part we were too timid, I think, to nail those down. And in part because at that point there was there's sort of like this tradition or momentum that a certain level of character was too high for the world. And I've always thought that if the game allows the player characters to go up to 20th level, and you want them to still be able to adventure in your campaign setting needs to be able to accommodate that level. That's why in the first edition D&D, all the higher level stuff, you always went to the outer planes because they'd out-leveled any of the content in the actual world.
Yeah, it does set up kind of an interesting narrative question, though, that I've seen some people ask before, which is if the Zephyr Guard is comprised of all these 15th level warrior types. Why? And we have 100 of them. Why do we need 4 level 17 PCs to do this stuff? And that's something that as adventure writers and developers, we just kind of need to work around.
Yeah.
And even when you're facing off against some of these highest level Zephyr Guard, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entirety of the Zephyr Guard is that level, but the ones that you're facing off against right now probably are. So there are ways to explain it, but it definitely is a challenge.
Yeah.
Especially for an urban adventure.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think part of the fact that this is the second largest city in the inner sea region, we can get away with having there be guards. And obviously, there's so much going on in this city that there would be people there in town that would, be higher level and be able to do things. In my head, it's not just that the player characters are high level that makes them the stars of the show. It's just the fact that they're the ones that the players are playing.
And they're the ones taking the initiative in this stuff.
Yeah,
so Katapesh is a city that is kind of on a bit of a lockdown for this adventure because of the political tension that exists. Let's see, you got a question. Is there a general limit on how much stuff you put in a city? Like, aren't you allowed to add infinite stuff to cities and new APs? Yeah, absolutely. But there is a very practical limit to how much stuff we can put in a city. It's based on either the number of pages we have set aside for the gazetteer or the number of pages we have set aside for the adventure itself. So Katapesh had that 64-page book decade ago. And you know what? That book could have totally been 300 pages
or 3,000, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on how much focus you want to give into every little building, every little group and organization and merchant, and even this adventure. I mean, levels aside, could have been, probably 3 times as long,
right?
And yeah, it could have taken up that much more space. So all that's really limiting it is how much word count the author and the developer have to play with.
Cool. So we start doing just random. There's a question there I want to answer.
Yeah.
So how do you guys feel about wizard dwarves being untrained in their clan daggers? Ran into a situation where a player asked if he could have their. So, I feel that's fine. Just because you're a dwarf doesn't mean you should clan daggers are not things that you're supposed to fight with. Clan daggers are things like this is the one that I guess it's like this is the first dagger that cut you loose from your mother or something like that. And it's not meant to be something that you stab people with, really. It's certainly something you could because it's a dagger.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be a wizard and you're using a knife, you're not a very good wizard.
Yeah, I think that we have a couple of different ancestry feats that do play into fighting with your clan dagger. So I think that there's a certain subculture within Dwarven society that explores that. But as far as a wizard not being proficient in the clan dagger, I think is also an interesting potential story background piece for yourself, because it's like, you go to you go back for your family reunion and you have your parents who are just like, why couldn't you have been like your other 4 siblings? Look, they all fight with clan daggers. Why aren't you proficient? Oh, right. You went to wizard school. I bet you're feeling very proud of yourself now. What would your ancestors think of you? I think could be a really fun thing, especially to have us always hounding the player.
It's also a case of like a lot of times the things that your character can't do just because of your class or your ancestor or something like that. That gives you a place to explore a non-normal character. Like one of my favorite characters is a bard who uses a scimitar, and that's not a bard weapon, and it's not even in second edition. It's I haven't quite wrapped my head around how would I make a bard that can fight with a scimitar, and on one level, maybe the bard just isn't as good fighting with a scimitar. That's fine. If you have, instead of a +1 to hit you, instead of having a +3 to hit, you have a +1 hit or something like that. You're a bard in the first place. Your role is not to be up in the front line fighting. If you do want to do it, you could, do the fighter archetype. There's other options. And as we produce more content, of course, there's going to be more content produced, which is kind of this chicken and the egg thing. But honestly, if you have a situation where your character is a dwarven wizard and you really want to be able to fight with that clan dagger, and there's not like a published feat or skill ability or anything out there that lets you do it, talk to your GM.
Yeah. And in this particular example, you're in luck because, in addition to the general feat of weapon proficiency, you can just take actually at that point, dwarven weapon familiarity doesn't quite do it for you.
Because it's not called dwarven clan dagger.
Yeah, but I think you become proficient in simple things, and you treat the martial ones as simple and the superior or the advanced ones as martial. So I think you have several different routes that you should be able to pull it off.
Yeah.
So I also see, how did you settle on those animal companions, and was there anything else you wanted to include? So when it came to the back matter for 149 at the very least, I had a fair amount of flexibility. It was written in that there was going to be a Witch Weirds Ecology of the Witch Weird article. Because spoilers, that's what the Pact Masters actually are. And so I ended up writing that. And I also had, I think, 6 pages of general adventure toolkit rules options. And I don't know that any of them were scripted for me. It was going to be, actually, I was going to have to do at least 1 page of magic items. But otherwise, I said, I really like 2nd edition poisons. Katapesh is a great place for that. 2 pages of poisons. I really like animal companions. Let's go with animal companions. I want to see more of those, and I always love designing them. So there's a page of those. There's the Zephyr Guard archetype, and then I'm missing something else. So, but as far as choosing those ones, it was really looking at what already existed in the 2nd edition core rulebook and asking myself what sort of other styles I wanted to have in there and what would fit a desert theme. And so Hyena was a great one, especially because we have the animal companions balanced against each other better in 2nd edition than 1st edition, where there were decidedly some winners and then there were the manta rays. So I really wanted a Hyena because Hyena was sort of a inferior selection in 1st edition. I really wanted to make sure that camel was in there because I wanted an alternative to horse as something with a mount trait. And then I like vultures. I really love vultures. And bird is fantastic, but I wanted something that could grow to be a little bit bigger and beefier.
Beefy vultures.
Yeah, so a couple of the ones that did not make it onto the list, sand eel, which shows up in the Katapesh campaign setting book, and also the it's not Jubuk, it's
the Daba.
Daba, which is a little jackal creature with a scorpion tail, which is pretty amusing.
Yeah. Going forward, the whole idea of, we've always sort of had a toolbox for adventures going along. We've always had new monsters and often had new magic items scattered throughout the body text of the adventure. But the concept of the adventure toolbox is really something that every volume of Age of Ashes, we kind of did it a different way, and we tried something different and approached it in a different way. And I think it's starting to settle down into an area where a writer of the adventure, in this case, this is how it worked out, is the writer of the adventure also has to write the new monsters and the adventure toolbox content. And all of that stuff going forward, we're working hard to get ways for those to integrate more directly in the adventure. So had that been the marching orders back when you were writing this, I mean, it would have been a case where it's like maybe when you it's sort of in there already. There's a point where you go talk with a bunch of the Poisoners Guild. We could have put in a section that said at the end of this whole area, if the PCs make friends with them, the Poisoner Guild gives them a bunch of poisons, and here's the poisons they give them, and it's new poisons from the back of the book. It's sort of implied that's how it works.
I think that's how it happened.
But and I think that might be the point where I think this is the first one where the author was the one that wrote all of that content, I think, actually, now that I think about it. Anyway, it's also complicated by the fact that this whole adventure path was written before the rules were done.
Yeah.
So there were challenges. Any other questions? We got time for a couple more.
Do we ever have a gnome as an AP end boss? Not that I know of, but we've definitely had one as the boss of a module.
Yeah.
And we've had at least one who was the boss of a Pathfinder Society scenario within the past year and a half. One of them is totally a bleachling who's not happy about anything. And another one was basically somebody who seems to have made a really bad deal with somebody of the Whispering Way, and just like,
wah, wah.
One of the best ways to stop the bleaching is to just be undead in the first place. This will be great.
A gnome end boss is an interesting idea. I mean, those types of things, I'm always looking for people to say, like, you've never done this, why not do that? I mean, that's how we got Karzug, because at that point, that was the 4th adventure path we were working on. And the feedback we gotten from the first 3 was like, every one of the first 3 adventure paths, the end boss was basically an evil god. And that turns out is a pretty good end boss. But people are like, why not just an evil wizard? And it ended up making a really cool idea. And then for Curse of the Crimson Throne, my personal challenge at that point was like people were kind of bagging on bards as being the goofy class that nobody ever played with. It's like, I'm going to make an adventure path where the bard's going to kill the entire party because she's the main villain. And
who took leadership now?
Yeah. And so those types of challenges I think are really fun. Building an adventure path where the end boss is unknown suggests specific types of plots that wouldn't work for anything else, which is the strength of, doing that sort of thing. So
I know how I would approach this sort of thing, which would be like, gnomes have obsessions. And this feels like the sort of situation where a villain at the end of an AP volume, rather than just the whole AP, could very readily be somebody who has a non-evil alignment. You could have a just standard neutral gnome who is utterly certain about X or is absolutely dead set on Y, even if Y is ultimately going to open the gates of the city and let the angry invaders in or whatever it is. But at least he'll get to finish his like thimble collection, and that'll make everything okay. As long as I die with my thimbles, it's good.
Ooh, like a rune giant thimble. He could live in it.
Are you turning gnomes into hermit crabs?
Is that bad?
If you do it more than once.
Okay.
So a whole bunch of really good possibilities as far as gnomes being villains, and I'm sure you could do an entire AP that has somebody behind it.
It's an interesting thing because gnomes are often viewed as like, the comic relief or the joke or something like that. And I think that there's an element of that just built in to the way that people have always treated gnomes as like the goofy tinkerers or the mad inventors and all of that. But for myself, that's the sort of thing that I just really, I like those challenges. I like the idea of like, I would approach it as probably by doing something unexpected. I'd have it be a gnome vampire or something like that, or a gnome lich, where it's like, this is a character that is super powerful, not because, it doesn't matter what you are. If you're a lich, you're tough. So.
Actually, just gnome undead or purposeful undead in general is great because no, I will live long enough to see through my experiment or whatever.
And I would use that whole element of like the gnome is never the bad guy. I would have him be on screen a lot and tell your characters like, it can't be the gnome. It's the gnome. All right. Point of gnome return. So we're about out of time. Before we wrap up, we should mention the Humble Bundle that's going on.
Yeah. So when it comes to understanding all of our great setting material, this is one of the best opportunities you have to grab a whole bunch of books to read, including a whole bunch that both of us have a lot of reason to be proud of. So that's going on right now and is going on for about another 16 days. This is I believe you can get about 40 different books, including several of the RPG books, but
it's all PDFs.
Mostly it's our campaign setting books.
Yeah, and they're specifically there's obviously first edition rules content in there, but the lore content, the whole point that this is going on is that this information is still good. I think the Sandpoint books, is the Druma book in there?
The Druma book is in there. So, Concordance of Rivals is in there.
Yep. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's got just a lot of really fascinating, interesting, fun stuff that, we're both really proud of. So check it out. We got Luis coming up next, I think, in a few minutes. Anything you want to say at the last minute, or?
I think that we might as well see about wrapping up. But as you said, Luis is going to be coming on to talk about Volume 6, so Pathfinder number 150. So you'll be able to hear out the remainder of Age of Ashes Adventure Path and end on a real high note.
Yeah, the spoilery of spoilers. Oh man, we'll have something to talk about. Like, how do you build hype for an adventure path where you're not sure you want to tell who the main boss is? It's tricky. Cool.
Anyway, great having you folks.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'll see you next time.